Seren Holloway had learned to whisper, not just to speak softly, but to make herself nearly inaudible, to compress her words into barely there breaths that wouldn't draw attention to the one thing about her that everyone seemed to notice. Her voice carried a rasp, a gravelly quality that had been there since birth, something the doctors called a minor vocal cord irregularity that gave her speech a distinctive, rough texture that sounded older than her years, almost masculine in its deepness for someone who stood barely 5'3" and weighed perhaps 110 pounds soaking wet. She'd been self-conscious about it her entire life, but nowhere had that self-consciousness turned into active shame, quite like it had at Lincoln Preparatory Academy. The school sat in the heart of Riverside, Connecticut, a sprawling brick complex that had been built in the 1960s and expanded haphazardly over the decades, creating a maze of interconnected buildings, outdoor courtyards, and covered walkways that connected the main academic wing to the gymnasium, the auditorium, and the athletic fields that stretched toward the tree line at the property's edge. Lincoln Prep had a reputation, the kind whispered about in the surrounding towns, as a place where the children of doctors and lawyers and business executives learned not just from textbooks, but from each other, where social hierarchies were established early and maintained ruthlessly, where fitting in mattered more than standing out, unless you stood out in precisely the right ways. Seren had transferred to Lincoln Prep at the start of the term, her family having relocated from Oregon after her father accepted a position at a medical research facility. She'd left behind a small alternative school where her voice had been just another quirk among many, where difference was expected and even celebrated, and found herself suddenly thrust into an environment where conformity was currency and any deviation from the norm was noted, catalogued, and often exploited. She'd known within the first week that she was in trouble. The first day had been unremarkable, the kind of anxious fog that all new students navigate, finding classrooms, memorizing locker combinations, trying to decode the unspoken rules that governed every social interaction. Seren had kept her head down, offered small smiles when people glanced her way, and tried to project an aura of friendly but unobtrusive existence. She'd succeeded, mostly, in remaining invisible. It wasn't until the second day, when Mr. Valenti called on her in American literature to read a passage from The Great Gatsby, that everything changed. She'd stood, cleared her throat softly and begun to read, her gravelly voice filling the classroom with Fitzgerald's prose, and she'd made it perhaps 3 sentences before she heard it, the barely suppressed snicker from somewhere behind her, then another, then a whispered comment she couldn't quite make out, but could definitely interpret from the tone. Mr. Valenti had frowned, called for attention, and Seren had continued reading, her face burning, her voice dropping even lower, becoming almost unintelligible as she rushed through the paragraph and practically fell back into her seat. After class, a girl with perfectly straightened blonde hair and the kind of casual confidence that came from never having questioned her place in the world, had stopped beside Seren's desk, smiled with what looked like genuine friendliness, and said, "Hey, don't worry about those jerks. I think your voice is actually kind of cool, very unique." The words had been kind, but something in the delivery, the slight emphasis on unique, had carried just enough ambiguity to plant seeds of doubt. Seren had smiled back, mumbled thanks in barely a whisper, and hurried to her next class. By the end of the first week, the pattern had established itself. Seren spoke as little as possible, and when she did speak, she kept her voice low, her responses brief, her contributions to class discussions minimal. She ate lunch alone in the library, claimed a small table near the back windows that overlooked the courtyard, and worked on homework or read, trying to create a bubble of purpose around her solitude so it looked like a choice rather than a circumstance. She'd noticed that the cafeteria operated on a complex social geography with certain tables claimed by certain groups, the hierarchy visible in the confidence of those who sat in the center of the large room versus those who huddled at the periphery, and she'd made the calculation that opting out entirely was safer than risking sitting in the wrong place, or, worse, sitting alone in a room full of people. Her classes were a mix of college preparatory courses, the kind of rigorous academic environment her parents had been pleased to secure for her, and she found that she could lose herself in the work, that when she was solving equations or analyzing text or conducting lab experiments, the rest of the world receded and her voice didn't matter because her brain was what counted. Her teachers seemed to appreciate her, calling on her less frequently once they realized she'd volunteer written work over verbal participation any time the option existed. And while she knew this accommodation probably wasn't doing her any favors in the long term, she was grateful for the respite. The bullying started small, so small she almost convinced herself she was imagining it. Cortland Ashford noticed her second week at Lincoln Prep, or more accurately, noticed her voice. Cortland was the kind of student who seemed to have been designed by some cosmic committee, tasked with creating the archetype of prep school aristocracy. 6 feet tall, with an athlete's build maintained through varsity lacrosse, dark hair always perfectly styled, a wardrobe that broadcast wealth without being ostentatious, and the easy charisma of someone who'd never experienced a moment of social uncertainty. He came from what the other students called old money. His father, some kind of investment banker who donated enough to the school over the years that Cortland's name was on a plaque outside the new science wing, and he carried himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who knew that consequences, if they came at all, would be minimal and easily managed. Seren's first direct interaction with Cortland happened in the main hallway between third and fourth period, a corridor that connected the academic wing to the arts building, wide enough to accommodate the flood of students changing classes, but still creating inevitable bottlenecks near the lockers. Seren had been at her locker, switching out books, when someone bumped her from behind, not hard enough to make her stumble, but firmly enough to make her drop the textbook she'd been holding. She'd bent to pick it up, mumbled "excuse me" in that low voice she'd perfected, and heard Cortland's voice, smooth and amused. "Dude, did you hear that? That's hilarious." She'd glanced up to see him looking at his friends, 2 other lacrosse players whose names she didn't know, all 3 grinning. "Hey, say something else," Cortland had called to her, and Seren had grabbed her book, closed her locker and walked away quickly, her face hot, her heart hammering. The next day, Cortland had bumped her again, same hallway, same time, and this time when she didn't react, didn't even look at him, he'd called after her, "Come on, don't be shy. We just want to hear that awesome voice." His friends had laughed, and Seren had kept walking, had made it to her next class, and sat in her seat and stared at her desk until her hands stopped shaking. By the 3rd week, it was happening daily. Not always Cortland, though he remained the primary instigator, but his circle had expanded to include others who'd caught on to the game, who'd found entertainment in trying to get Seren to speak, in laughing at the sound when she did. They'd call out questions in the hallway, ask her for the time or for directions to classrooms they obviously already knew how to find, and when she'd answer or simply shake her head and keep walking, they'd imitate her voice, dropping their tones into an exaggerated gravelly rasp, making each other laugh. Serene started taking different routes between classes, mapping out longer paths that avoided the main hallway during peak times. She timed her arrivals to coincide with the bell, slipping into classrooms just as they were starting, so there was no time for pre-class conversation. She stopped going to the library for lunch, worried that Cortland's group might start showing up there, and instead found a quiet corner of the auditorium's upper balcony, a spot behind the last row of seats where she could eat her sandwich and be reasonably confident no one would find her. She told no one. Not her parents, who asked each evening how school was going and seemed satisfied with her vague answers about making friends and adjusting to the workload. Not her teachers, who saw her as a quiet but capable student and had no window into the social dynamics that unfolded outside their classrooms. Not the school counselor, whose office she'd passed dozens of times and never once considered entering. What would she say? That people laughed at her voice, that someone bumped into her in the hallway. It sounded trivial even in her own mind, the kind of thing adults would tell her to ignore, to rise above, to report if it got worse, with the implicit message that it hadn't gotten bad enough yet to warrant intervention. What Seren didn't tell anyone, what she actively hid from everyone at Lincoln Prep, was that she'd spent the last 6 years training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It had started when she was younger, after her uncle, a career Marine who'd done tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, had sat her down one evening during a family visit and told her something she'd never forgotten. The world isn't always fair to people who are different, and you've got something that makes you stand out. You can let that be a weakness, or you can make sure you're never actually weak, even if people think you are. He'd introduced her to a friend who ran a BJJ gym in Portland, and Seren had fallen in love with it immediately, with the chess-like strategy of grappling, with the way size mattered less than technique, with the empowerment that came from knowing she could defend herself if she needed to. She'd trained 4 times a week for 6 years, had earned her blue belt, and was working toward purple when the family had moved. She'd competed in a dozen tournaments, had won more than half her matches, had learned not just the physical techniques, but the mental discipline, the patience, the ability to stay calm under pressure and wait for opportunities. Her instructors had praised her natural aptitude for it, her flexibility and her quick strategic thinking that allowed her to see 2 or 3 moves ahead, to set up sweeps and submissions from positions that looked disadvantageous. But her uncle had also made her promise something, had sat her down before her first tournament and said, "You're learning this for defense, for confidence, for discipline. You're not learning it to prove anything or to hurt anyone. If someone comes at you and you have to protect yourself, fine. But you don't start fights. You don't use this to show off. You walk away whenever you can, and you only use it when you have no other choice." Seren had promised, and she'd meant it. She'd seen what violence looked like in her uncle's eyes sometimes, the shadows that lingered from things he'd experienced, and she'd understood that fighting, even when justified, left marks. So she said nothing when Cortland bumped her. She stayed silent when his friends mimicked her voice. She walked away every time, and she told herself that walking away was the right choice, the mature choice, the choice her uncle would approve of. She told herself that high school was temporary, that these people wouldn't matter in a year or 2, that responding to their childishness would only validate their behavior and invite more of it. But every time she walked away, she felt something small and hard forming in her chest, something that grew heavier with each incident, each laugh, each imitation of her voice that echoed in the hallway. She felt it when she practiced at home, drilling movements in her bedroom when her parents thought she was doing homework. Felt it when she'd found a local BJJ gym and went to open mat sessions on weekends, rolling with people who treated her as a training partner and nothing more. She felt it, and she ignored it, and she kept walking away. The 4th week brought a new development. Dashiell Chen appeared in her peripheral vision on a Monday morning, materializing beside her at the water fountain near the gymnasium, with the kind of casual friendliness that suggested he hadn't noticed or didn't care about her social standing. "You're in my AP bio class, right?" he'd asked, and Seren had nodded, wary. "I'm completely lost on the cellular respiration unit. Are you getting it? You seem like you're following along." He'd smiled, an open expression without apparent agenda, and Seren had hesitated, then whispered her reply, something about the electron transport chain and ATP synthesis, and Dashiell had listened attentively, asked a follow-up question, thanked her genuinely, and walked away before she'd fully processed that someone had voluntarily chosen to talk to her. Dashiell showed up again 2 days later, this time in the library where Seren had cautiously returned during lunch, figuring that Cortland's group wouldn't follow her there. Dashiell had asked if the seat across from her was taken, and when she'd shaken her head, he'd sat down with his own lunch and a calculus textbook, and they'd eaten in comfortable silence for a few minutes before he'd looked up and said, "So is it just me, or is the cafeteria kind of a nightmare?" Serene had smiled slightly, nodded, and Dashiell had continued, "I usually eat in here too. Quieter. Better for actually thinking. Plus, the cafeteria smells like a combination of industrial cleaner and regret." It had made her laugh, a small, quick sound she'd tried to suppress but hadn't been fast enough to stop, and Dashiell had grinned at her, pleased with himself. They'd started eating lunch together after that, not every day, but often enough that Seren began to expect it, to look forward to fourth period ending because it meant she might see Dashiell in the library. He was different from most Lincoln prep students in ways that were hard to quantify, something in his demeanor that suggested he was present at the school, but not entirely of it, observing the social dynamics with more amusement than investment. He was tall, mixed race with features that suggested Asian and white ancestry, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and glasses he was constantly pushing up his nose, and he dressed in a style that could only be described as deliberately rumpled, like he'd gotten dressed in the dark and decided that was good enough. They talked about classes mostly, about books they were reading, about the elaborate mythology of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which Dashiell had opinions about that were both passionate and surprisingly well-informed, about music, and about the general absurdity of high school social hierarchies. Seren found herself speaking more when it was just the two of them, her voice still quiet, but less whisper-like, and Dashiell never commented on it, never seemed to notice or care that she sounded different. He treated her like a person, like someone whose thoughts were interesting and whose company was enjoyable, and it was such a stark contrast to the rest of her Lincoln prep experience that she sometimes had to remind herself not to be suspicious of it, not to wait for the other shoe to drop. The 5th week, the cafeteria incident happened. Seren had been walking past the cafeteria entrance, heading toward the library, when someone called her name. She'd turned reflexively, a mistake, and found Cortland standing near the doorway with his usual group, plus several others, maybe 7 or 8 people total. "Hey, we were just talking about you," Cortland had said, loud enough that people nearby had stopped to listen. "My friend Brock here doesn't believe that you actually sound like that. He thinks you're faking it for attention. Can you settle a bet?" Seren had felt everyone's eyes on her, felt her face heating, felt that hard thing in her chest pressing against her ribs. She'd turned to leave, and Cortland had stepped into her path. "Come on, don't be rude. Just say one thing, anything. How about Cortland is awesome?" His friends had laughed and someone had pulled out their phone, pointed it at her. Seren had looked at the phone, at Cortland's expectant smirk, at the gathering crowd, and she'd felt something in her snap, not into action, but into a kind of cold clarity. She could hurt him. She knew exactly how she could hurt him. She could drop her level, shoot for his legs, take him down, establish mount, and he wouldn't have any idea what was happening until it was over. She could make him feel as helpless as she felt right now. Instead, she dropped her lunch bag, watched it hit the floor, and while everyone's attention was momentarily on the bag, she'd sidestepped Cortland and walked quickly away, her vision blurring, her heart rate elevated but her breathing controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd been taught. Behind her, she'd heard Cortland call out in that exaggerated rasp, "Come on, don't be like that!" And then laughter, so much laughter. She'd made it to a bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and sat on the closed toilet seat with her head in her hands until the bell rang for next period. That video went up on Instagram that evening. 15 seconds of Cortland calling her name, Her turning, his request, her dropping her lunch and leaving, his mock disappointed commentary after. The video had filtered through Lincoln Prep's social media ecosystem overnight, and by Tuesday morning it seemed like everyone had seen it. Seren had felt the weight of it in every classroom, in every hallway, in the way conversations stopped when she passed and restarted in whispers after she'd gone. Dashiell had found her at lunch, his expression tight with anger he was clearly trying to control, and said, "I saw it. That was fucked up. I'm sorry that happened." Seren had just shrugged, unable to articulate anything useful, and they'd sat in silence for most of the period. The 6th week brought Dashiell fully into Cortland's crosshairs. It started with comments in the hallway when Dashiell and Seren were together, Cortland calling out, "Oh look, the island of misfit toys found each other," and variations on that theme. Then it escalated to Cortland's group positioning themselves between Seren and wherever she was trying to go, forcing Dashiell to physically navigate around them if he wanted to stay with her, turning it into a kind of game where they'd close ranks and then step aside at the last second, laughing at the flash of anger that crossed Dashiell's face. Dashiell started sitting with her every day at lunch, a show of solidarity that Seren appreciated and worried about in equal measure. She told him he didn't have to, that she was fine, that she didn't want him to get dragged into her problems. Dashiell had looked at her steadily and said, "First of all, these aren't your problems. These are Cortland being a dick problems, which is a universal issue. Second, I'm not here out of pity. I'm here because I like hanging out with you. You're smart, you're funny when you let yourself be, and you have excellent taste in graphic novels. Cortland can go fuck himself." The profanity had surprised her, coming from Dashiell's generally mild-mannered demeanor, and she'd smiled despite everything. They'd started texting too, long, rambling conversations that stretched into the late evening about everything and nothing, the kind of exchanges that felt more honest than face-to-face interaction sometimes allowed. Dashiell sent her memes, book recommendations, playlists he'd made on Spotify, and Seren found herself responding in ways she never would have out loud, using text to articulate thoughts that felt too vulnerable to speak. They talked about their families, their plans after graduation, their anxieties about the future, and Seren began to feel something shifting in her chest, that hard, heavy thing beginning to transform into something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. The 7th week, Cortland struck at both of them during lunch. Seren and Dashiell had been in the library as usual, and when the period ended and they'd walked out together, Cortland and 4 of his friends had been waiting in the hallway just outside the library entrance. "Well, well, well," Cortland had said, his voice carrying that particular quality of performative menace, playing to an invisible audience. "If it isn't the Beauty and the Beast, except I'm not sure which one of you is which." His friends had laughed dutifully. Dashiell had tried to walk past, and Cortland had moved to block him, had put a hand on Dashiell's chest. "Where you going so fast? We're having a conversation here." Dashiell had brushed Cortland's hand away, said, "We have class," and Cortland had shoved him, not hard but deliberately, testing boundaries. Seren had seen Dashiell's hands curl into fists, had seen him force them to relax, and she'd grabbed his arm, pulled him away, started walking quickly. Behind them, Cortland had called out, "That's right! Let the girl with the man voice protect you." And his friends had howled with laughter. They'd made it to Dashiell's next class, and Seren had said, voice barely audible, "I'm sorry." And Dashiell had shaken his head. "Don't apologize for him. That's not on you." But Seren had seen the humiliation in his eyes, the impotent anger at being shoved and choosing not to fight back, and she'd felt guilt settle over her like a weight. This was her fault. If Dashiell hadn't befriended her, hadn't chosen to sit with her, hadn't associated himself with the school's designated target, he'd be fine. He'd be invisible in all the good ways. That night, lying in bed, Seren had allowed herself to imagine it. allowed herself to visualize walking up to Cortland, waiting for him to shove her the way he'd shoved Dashiell, and then responding. She could see it so clearly: parry the shove, control the wrist, step offline, use his momentum against him, take him down, establish a dominant position. She could submit him, could make him tap, could prove in front of everyone that he wasn't untouchable. She could do it without seriously hurting him, could show perfect control while demonstrating absolute dominance. But then what? She'd be the girl who attacked another student. She'd be expelled, probably. There'd be consequences, repercussions that would follow her. And more than that, she'd be proving that violence was the answer, that might made right, that the way to deal with bullies was to become one yourself. Her uncle's voice echoed in her head. You walk away whenever you can. She'd been walking away, but she was running out of places to walk to. The 8th week brought the social media escalation. Someone created a fake account on Instagram at Serene's Manlier Voice that posted edited clips from various videos people had taken around school, all of them featuring Serene's voice dubbed over with exaggerated sound effects or mixed with clips of celebrities saying ridiculous things. The account gained 100 followers the first day, 300 by the end of the week, and every post felt like a fresh violation. Serene reported the account, but Instagram's response was automated and unhelpful, stating they'd review it but taking no immediate action. Dashiell was tagged in several of the posts with captions like, "This guy's girlfriend sounds like Batman," and "Relationship goals when she's deeper than you are." The posts made Serene want to disappear completely, to transfer schools, to move to another state. She stopped looking at social media entirely, deleted the apps from her phone, but she couldn't delete the knowledge that it was out there, that people were laughing, that her voice had become a punchline for the entire school. One evening, Dashiell video called her, and they'd talked for an hour. Dashiell stretched out on his bed with his physics textbook, and Serene curled up in her desk chair, and the call had felt normal and good and like proof that someone saw past the thing everyone else was fixated on. "You know your voice isn't actually that deep, right?" Dashiell had said at one point. "Like it's distinctive, but they're acting like you sound like James Earl Jones or something. It's not even that unusual. They're just assholes looking for something to fixate on." Serene had felt tears prick her eyes at the casual validation, at someone acknowledging the absurdity of the whole situation. The 9th week, something in Serene's demeanor began to shift. It wasn't conscious at first, more of an accumulation reaching critical mass, but people who'd known her since she'd arrived started to notice. She walked differently, her posture straighter, her shoulders back instead of hunched forward protectively. She made eye contact when people spoke to her, instead of staring at the floor. She didn't whisper quite as much, allowing her natural voice to emerge in classes when teachers called on her, and if people snickered, she didn't shrink the way she used to. The change was internal as much as external. That hard thing in her chest, that weight she'd been carrying, had transformed into something else, something that felt like compressed energy, like a spring coiling tighter and tighter. She found herself thinking less about walking away and more about the mechanics of how she'd respond if she stopped walking. She caught herself analyzing Cortland's stance, his balance, his center of gravity, cataloging his physical tells like she would with a tournament opponent. She started going to the local BJJ gym 3 times a week instead of just weekends, rolling harder than she needed to, accepting matches with people 50 pounds heavier than her, and working until she was exhausted, channeling everything she couldn't express at school into the mats. Her coach noticed, pulled her aside after a particularly intense session where she'd tapped out a much larger opponent. "You're rolling angry," he'd said. "Not necessarily bad, but I can tell." "Something going on?" Serene had shrugged, said it was just school stress, and her coach had studied her for a moment before nodding. "Anger can fuel you, but don't let it control you. Remember, jiu-jitsu is about efficiency, not emotion. You stay calm, you win." She'd nodded, bowed out, and driven home thinking about that concept, staying calm. She'd been calm for weeks. Where had it gotten her? The 10th week, Cortland pushed too far. It was a Friday, end of the day, and Seren had been at her locker collecting her things for the weekend when she'd felt someone come up behind her, too close, violating her personal space. She'd turned to find Cortland there, his friends flanking him like always. "Hey," he'd said, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "I want to apologize." Seren had frozen, suspicious, waiting for the punchline. Cortland had continued, "No, really. I think we got off on the wrong foot. I was thinking maybe we could start over. What do you say?" He'd extended his hand for a handshake, and Seren had looked at it, at his face, trying to read his intention. Something in his eyes, a glint of amusement barely suppressed, warned her, but part of her wanted to believe it, wanted to think that maybe this could end without confrontation. She'd reached out to shake his hand, and Cortland had gripped it, held it, and then pulled her closer, while his other hand came up with his phone, positioning it for a selfie. He'd held her there, forcing her to stand beside him while he grinned at the camera, and then he'd released her and stepped back. "Smile for the camera," he'd said, and his friends had laughed. "Wait, can you say, 'Cortland is my best friend' for the video? Come on, just once." Seren had looked at him, at the phone still recording, at his expectant expression, and something in her had gone very still. Not the shrinking stillness of fear, but the controlled stillness of a predator calculating distance and timing. Her hands, which had been relaxed, curled slightly. Her weight shifted almost imperceptibly onto the balls of her feet, and for just a second she allowed herself to visualize it. Darce choke, arm drag to back take, rear naked choke, hold until he tapped or slept. 3 seconds to establish it, maybe 5 to finish it. Cortland must have seen something in her face, some flicker of the thoughts behind her eyes, because his smile faltered for just an instant before returning, more force this time. "Wow, so hostile," he'd said, performing for his friends. "I try to be nice, and this is what I get." He'd walked away, his entourage following, and Seren had stood at her locker with her hand shaking, not from fear this time, but from the effort of restraint, from the knowledge that she'd come very close to crossing a line she'd promised herself she wouldn't cross. That weekend, she'd sat down with herself and her thoughts and forced herself to confront what was happening. She was changing. The person who'd arrived at Lincoln Prep 10 weeks ago, who'd been willing to disappear into the walls to avoid conflict, was being replaced by someone else, someone harder and angrier and less willing to accept abuse in the name of taking the high road. Part of her was grateful for the evolution, saw it as necessary armor. Part of her was worried she was becoming the kind of person her uncle had warned her against, someone who looked for excuses to use what they knew, who let ego and hurt override judgment. She'd texted Dashiell late Sunday night, "Do you think there's a point where not fighting back is actually the wrong choice?" He'd responded almost immediately, philosophically or personally. She'd typed, "Both, I guess," and waited. His response had taken longer, long enough that she'd thought maybe he'd fallen asleep, but then her phone had buzzed. "I think there's a difference between not fighting back and being a victim. You can stand up for yourself without using your fists, but also I think if someone physically attacks you, defending yourself isn't wrong. It's the initiating that's the problem. Why? What's going on?" She'd stared at his question for a long time, typed and deleted several responses, and finally settled on, "Just thinking. I'm tired of feeling like I'm losing by refusing to play their game." Dashiell, "You're not losing. You're refusing to participate in something stupid. That's different. But I get it. I'm tired of it too." Seren, "Would you think less of me if I stopped walking away?" Dashiell, "I'd think you were human. But I'd also worry about what they'd do to retaliate. These people have money and lawyers and parents who donate to the school. We don't. The casual "we" in that sentence had made something warm bloom in Seren's chest, even as she'd acknowledged the truth of his concern. Monday of the 11th week, Cortland noticed the change in Seren's demeanor. She'd been walking down the main hallway, and when she'd seen him approaching with his friends, she hadn't altered her course. Hadn't stepped aside, hadn't ducked into a classroom, hadn't pulled out her phone to avoid eye contact. She'd kept walking, her pace steady, her gaze straight ahead, and when Cortland had moved to block her path, she'd stopped, looked directly at him, and waited. The hallway around them had grown quieter, students sensing something different in the dynamic, slowing to watch. Cortland had seemed momentarily uncertain, then recovered, smiled his usual smirk. "Excuse me," he'd said, exaggerating courtesy. "You're in my way." Seren had held his gaze, said nothing, and after a beat, Cortland had stepped aside with an exaggerated bow, saying, "By all means proceed," in a mockery of formality. Seren had walked past him, felt his eyes on her back, heard one of his friends mutter, "What was that about?" and Cortland's response, uncertain, "I don't know. Weird." That afternoon, Dashiell had found her after school in the parking lot where she'd been unlocking her bike from the rack. "People are saying you faced down Cortland in the hallway," he'd said, and Seren had shrugged. "I didn't do anything. I just didn't move." Dashiell had studied her face. "You look different. Like your whole energy is different. Did something happen over the weekend?" Seren had considered how to answer, had settled on partial truth. "I just decided I'm done being scared. I'm not going to start anything, but I'm not going to keep acting like I'm the one who should be ashamed." Dashiell had smiled at that, a genuine expression of approval and relief. "Good. You shouldn't be. None of this is your fault." Then his expression had shifted, become more serious. "But be careful, okay? Cortland doesn't like not being in control. If he feels like you're challenging him, he might escalate." Seren had nodded, touched by his concern, and said, "I know. I'm not trying to challenge him. I'm just not going to hide anymore." That evening, Cortland posted a new video on his Instagram story, a compilation of clips of Seren in various hallways and classrooms, all focused on moments where she spoke, with the caption, "Lincoln Prep's Batman speaks." Why does she even try? Seren saw it because someone at school apparently had screenshot it and sent it to half the student body. For the first time since the bullying had started, Seren didn't feel humiliation when she saw it. She felt anger, clean and clarifying, and beneath the anger, she felt something else, something that felt like certainty settling into place. The 12th week began with an incident in the computer lab. Seren and Dashiell had been working on a group project, sitting at adjacent computers, when Cortland's group had filed in for their scheduled class period. Cortland had walked past Seren's computer, paused and said, "Hey Dashiell, can your girlfriend ask the teacher something for us?" "We want to hear her do it." Dashiell had twisted in his chair, his jaw tight, and said, "Leave us alone, Cortland." Cortland had leaned against the desk between them, his posture casual, but his presence deliberately intrusive. "I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to her. Come on, just one question to the teacher. Ask him if we can leave early today. Use your pretty voice." He'd grinned at his own joke, and his friends had positioned themselves around the area, creating an audience. Seren had continued typing, ignoring him, and Cortland had reached out and closed her laptop. That had made her stop, had made her turn to look at him, and something in her expression must have registered, because Cortland's smile had faltered slightly before he'd recovered. "Oh, is that a problem?" he'd asked. "Did I interrupt something important?" "Yes," Seren had said, her voice quiet but clear, each word deliberately articulated. "You did. Move." It wasn't a request. It was a statement, delivered with absolute absence of fear, and the computer lab had gone silent, everyone watching. Cortland had straightened, had puffed up slightly the way insecure men do when confronted, and said, "Or what? What are you going to do about it?" He'd been smiling, but his eyes were calculating, reassessing, trying to figure out when exactly the dynamic had shifted. Serene had stood up slowly, her movements controlled, and she'd stepped around her chair to face him directly. They were close enough that Cortland's height advantage was obvious. He had at least 8 inches on her, but Serene's posture was balanced, grounded, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her weight distributed in a way that anyone with grappling experience would have recognized as athletic readiness. "I'm not going to do anything," she'd said, her gravelly voice steady. "Because you're going to move. Because you're going to leave us alone. Because you're going to stop being a coward who picks on people for entertainment." The word coward had hit Cortland like a physical blow. She'd seen it register on his face, seen his jaw clench and his hands curl into fists. For a second, she'd thought he might actually swing at her, had felt every muscle in her body prepare to respond. But then Mr. Patterson, the computer lab teacher, had called from his desk, "Is there a problem over there?" And the moment had broken. Cortland had stepped back, had forced a laugh that sounded hollow. "No problem, Mr. Patterson. Just having a conversation." He'd looked at Serene, tried to re-establish his usual condescending expression, but something about it looked uncertain now, less automatic. "We're not done," he'd said quietly, "just for her." And then he'd walked away to his own computer station. Dashiell had grabbed Serene's arm as she sat back down, his eyes wide. "What was that?" he'd whispered urgently. "You just called out Cortland Ashford, in front of everyone. Are you insane?" Serene had felt her hands trembling with adrenaline, had clasped them together under the desk to hide it. "I'm tired," she'd whispered back. "I'm just tired of it." That night, Dashiell had called her instead of texting. "Okay, real talk," he'd said without preamble. "What's going on with you? And don't say nothing, because you're acting completely different, and I'm worried Cortland's going to actually hurt you, and I don't know what to do about it." His voice had carried genuine fear, and Serene had felt a rush of affection for him, mixed with guilt that she was putting him in this position. "I need to tell you something," she'd said, and then she'd explained it. The 6 years of BJJ, the blue belt, the competitions, the promise to her uncle, the reason she'd been walking away from every confrontation. "I could handle him," she'd said. "I know I could. That's the problem. I could hurt him, actually hurt him, and part of me really wants to. But I promised I wouldn't unless I had no other choice, unless someone was in real danger, and I don't know where that line is anymore." Dashiell had been quiet for a long moment, processing. "So, you're basically a secret badass, and you've been letting Cortland push you around because of a promise." Serene had smiled, despite the seriousness of the conversation. "That's reductive, but essentially yes." "Dashiell, why didn't you tell me?" "Serene, because I didn't want you to expect me to do something about it. I didn't want to be that person." Another pause. "Are you mad?" she'd asked. "Mad? Number? Confused? A little? Impressed? Definitely. Also freaked out because now I'm imagining all the times Cortland could have pushed you too far and you could have put him in the hospital, and also I'm slightly insulted that you thought I'd judge you for being able to defend yourself." His tone had been light, but underneath it she'd heard the real emotion. Relief, maybe, that there was an explanation for her recent behavior and concern about where it might lead. They'd talked for another hour, Dashiell asking questions about training, about competitions, about what it actually felt like to fight, and Serene answering as honestly as she could. By the end of the call, she'd felt lighter, like sharing the secret had released some of the pressure that had been building. "Promise me something," Dashiell had said before they hung up. "Promise that if you do decide to stop walking away, you'll tell me first. Not to stop you, just so I'm prepared." "Deal?" Serene had promised. Wednesday of the 12th week, the incident with the cafeteria happened that would prove to be the setup for everything that followed. Seren had decided to eat in the cafeteria instead of the library, a deliberate choice to stop hiding, and Dashiell had joined her, both of them sitting at a small table near the windows, deliberately in the open rather than at the periphery. They'd been halfway through lunch when Cortland's group had approached, 7 or 8 of them, and the cafeteria around them had grown noticeably quieter, students sensing drama. "Well, well," Cortland had said, standing beside their table with his arms crossed. "Look who decided to join civilization. We're honored." His tone had been mocking, but there'd been an edge to it, something sharper than his usual performative cruelty. He was still reeling from the computer lab confrontation, Seren realized, still trying to re-establish dominance. Dashiell had started to respond, but Seren had put her hand on his arm, stilling him, and looked up at Cortland. "What do you want?" Her voice, that distinctive, gravelly rasp, had carried in the quiet cafeteria, and she'd seen several people pull out their phones, starting to record. Cortland had pulled out a chair, sat down uninvited at their table. "I want to understand something. I've been trying to figure it out for weeks. Why do you even bother coming here? I mean, look around." He'd gestured at the cafeteria. "Everyone here thinks you're a joke. That voice, that whole vibe you've got going on. You could transfer, you could do online school, you could do literally anything else. But you keep showing up, keep inflicting yourself on everyone. Why?" The question had been designed to hurt, and it had. Seren felt it land like a punch to the stomach, but she'd kept her expression neutral, had maintained eye contact. "Because I have every right to be here. Same as you." Her voice hadn't wavered. Cortland had laughed, but it sounded forced. "Right, sure. Well, let me explain something to you. There's a hierarchy here, okay? There are people who belong and people who don't. And you," he'd leaned forward, "you don't. You're here on borrowed time, and the sooner you accept that and disappear, the better it'll be for everyone." Dashiell had stood up then, his chair scraping loudly. "That's enough. You need to leave now." Cortland had looked up at him, then stood himself, stepping closer, using his height advantage. "Or what, Chen? You going to do something about it? Because from where I'm standing, you're even more pathetic than she is. At least she has an excuse for that voice. What's yours for being a complete loser?" Seren had stood too, positioning herself between them, and the movement had been instinctive, protective, her body responding before her brain fully engaged. She'd put her hand on Dashiell's chest, pushing him back gently, and turned to face Cortland. "Leave him alone. He's not part of this." Her voice had been low, controlled, but something in her tone had made Cortland take a small step back. "Oh, protective now?" Cortland had recovered his smirk. "That's cute. Fine. Let's make this simpler." He'd picked up Seren's lunch tray, held it for a moment, and then dumped it. Food and drink spilling across the table and onto the floor, some of it splashing onto Seren's shirt. The cafeteria had erupted in noise, gasps and laughter and shocked exclamations, and phones had appeared everywhere, dozens of them, all recording. Seren had looked down at her ruined lunch, at the mess on her clothes, and then back up at Cortland, and something in her face must have transmitted her thoughts, because Cortland had stepped back again, his expression flickering between triumph and uncertainty. Seren's hands had curled into fists, her breathing had shifted, deeper and more controlled, and she'd felt every technique she knew cycling through her mind, a catalogue of options, each one tempting. Dashiell had grabbed her arm. "Don't," he'd said quietly, urgently. "Seren, don't. He's not worth it." And something about hearing her name, about the genuine worry in Dashiell's voice, had cut through the red haze forming at the edges of her vision. She'd uncurled her fists, had taken a breath, and then bent down to start picking up the mess. The cafeteria had watched in silence as Seren gathered soiled napkins and food scraps, as Dashiell joined her, and as Cortland stood there looking somehow deflated, despite having apparently won the confrontation. "That's what I thought," Cortland had finally said, but even he seemed to know the words were hollow. He'd walked away with his friends, and the cafeteria had slowly returned to normal volume, but the videos had already started uploading, another viral moment in Seren's ongoing humiliation. That afternoon, the video had spread throughout Lincoln Prep's social media networks. Seren had gone home, showered, changed clothes, and lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling something fundamental shifting inside her. She'd kept her promise. She'd walked away, again. She'd taken the high road, again. And she felt worse than if she'd fought back, felt the humiliation and the impotent anger settling into her bones like a poison. Her uncle called that evening, their weekly video chat that she'd maintained since the move. He'd taken one look at her face and asked what was wrong. Serene had tried to deflect, but he'd pushed, and eventually she'd told him everything. The bullying, the escalation, the video today. All of it. He'd listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively darker. When she'd finished, he'd been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd said, "I need to tell you something about that promise I asked you to make. About walking away." Seren had nodded, waiting. "I asked you to make that promise because I didn't want you to become someone who used violence as a first resort. I didn't want you to be like I was, someone who'd been so conditioned to fight that I forgot how to not fight. But here's what I didn't tell you, what I should have told you. There's a difference between choosing peace and accepting victimization. Choosing peace from a position of strength is admirable. Accepting abuse because you're afraid of what you might do if you don't. That's not what I wanted for you." He'd leaned closer to his camera. "If someone attacks you, you defend yourself. That's not breaking your promise. That's surviving. And if someone creates a situation where you have no choice but to respond physically, then the fault is theirs, not yours. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Seren had felt tears building. "I don't know if I can control it if I start. What if I hurt him too badly?" Her uncle had shaken his head. "You're trained. You know control. Trust yourself. And trust that you're a good person who won't go further than necessary. But stop letting this kid torture you because you're afraid of who you might become. You already know who you are. You're someone who's been showing remarkable restraint under impossible circumstances. You're not a monster. You're just a person who's been pushed too far." After the call ended, Seren had sat with his words, had let them settle into her understanding of the situation. The promise hadn't been about never defending herself. It had been about never being the instigator, never using her skills to dominate or intimidate. She'd upheld that, but she'd taken it further than her uncle had intended, had martyred herself in the name of peace, and for what? So Cortland could have free rein to make her life miserable? So every other student at Lincoln Prep could learn that staying silent was rewarded and standing up for yourself was punished. She'd gone to the gym that night, late open mat, and rolled for 2 hours straight, working through positions, drilling escapes, accepting challenges from everyone available. Her coach had watched from the sidelines, and when she'd finally stopped, exhausted and clear-headed for the first time in weeks, he'd called her over. "Whatever you're working through, looks like you're close to figuring it out. Just remember, jiu-jitsu is about leverage, timing, and patience. You wait for your moment, and then you take it, but you take it clean, no emotion, just technique." Friday morning, Seren walked into Lincoln Prep feeling fundamentally different than she had every other day since she'd arrived. Her posture was upright, her gaze direct, and students noticed, giving her wider berth in the hallways without necessarily understanding why. She met Dashiell at his locker, and he'd taken one look at her and said, "Okay, what happened?" She'd smiled slightly. "I talked to my uncle." "I figured some things out." Dashiell had studied her face. "Are you okay?" Seren had nodded. "I'm done being not okay. That afternoon, final period, Seren was headed to her locker when she'd heard raised voices from the hallway near the gym. She'd followed the sound and found Dashiell backed up against a wall, Cortland standing close, too close, with 3 of his friends forming a semicircle. "I'm so sick of you," Cortland had been saying. "You think you're some kind of hero sitting with that freak every day? You think you're making some kind of statement? All you're doing is painting a target on yourself." Dashiell had tried to sidestep, and Cortland had shoved him back against the wall, harder this time. "I'm talking to you. You don't walk away from me." Seren had dropped her backpack right there in the hallway, the sound making everyone turn, and she'd walked toward the group with a measured pace that made Cortland's friends step aside instinctively. "Get away from him," Seren had said, her gravelly voice carrying clearly. "Now." Cortland had turned to face her, his expression cycling through surprise and annoyance before landing on something like glee. "Oh, look, the girlfriend's here to save you. How embarrassing for you, Chen." He'd kept one hand on Dashiell's chest, pinning him casually against the wall. "Last chance," Seren had said, stopping about 5 feet away, her stance balanced, her hands loose at her sides. "Leave him alone and walk away." Her voice had been calm, almost gentle, which had made the words somehow more threatening. Cortland had laughed, had turned back to Dashiell, and had drawn his fist back like he was going to punch him. Seren had moved. She'd closed the distance in 2 quick steps, had caught Cortland's wrist before he could fully commit to the punch, and had used his own momentum against him, stepping offline and pulling him past his center of balance. Cortland had stumbled, caught himself, spun back toward her with anger replacing his amusement, and had swung at her, a wide looping punch that telegraphed itself from a mile away. Seren had slipped it easily, had dropped her level, and had shot for a double-leg takedown, driving through Cortland's hips and putting him on his back on the hallway floor before he'd fully processed what was happening. The sound of his back hitting the floor had echoed in the suddenly silent hallway, and Seren had immediately established mount, her knees tight against his ribs, her weight distributed properly to make it nearly impossible for him to buck her off. Cortland had tried anyway, had bridged his hips and pushed at her, and Seren had rode out the movement easily, had maintained position with the kind of technical precision that comes from years of practice. "Get off me!" Cortland had yelled, his face reddening, and he'd tried to punch her from his back, wild, desperate swings that Seren had blocked or avoided without effort. Around them, students had materialized from everywhere, forming a circle, phones out, everyone shouting. And Cortland's friends had started forward, but Dashiell had stepped between them, his arms spread, yelling, "Don't!" with enough force that they'd actually stopped. Seren had been focused entirely on Cortland, who was bucking and twisting beneath her, trying everything he could think of to escape, his movements growing more panicked as nothing worked. She'd controlled his wrists, had kept her weight centered and low, and had spoken quietly just to him. "I told you to leave him alone." You didn't listen. Cortland had tried to spit at her, had turned his head to yell for his friends, and his voice had been high and strained. "Get her off me! Help me!" That was when Seren had realized something. She'd mounted him, she'd established dominance, she'd proven her point. She could transition to a submission, could choke him unconscious if she wanted to, could make him tap out in front of everyone. And part of her wanted that. Wanted to finish what she'd started, wanted to make him feel as helpless as he'd made her feel for weeks. But looking down at him, seeing the panic in his eyes, the genuine fear, she'd felt the anger drain away, replaced by something like pity. He looked pathetic. He looked exactly like what he was, a bully who'd never been challenged, whose entire identity crumbled the moment someone pushed back. She'd been about to step off him, about to end it on her own terms, when Cortland had screamed. Not a yell for help, but an actual scream, high-pitched and terrified, and the sound of it had shocked everyone in the hallway into silence. "Help!" he'd screamed again. "Somebody help me!" and his voice had cracked on the last word, raw with genuine fear. What Cortland didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Principal Warren's office was directly around the corner, maybe 50 feet away, and his door had been open. The scream brought him running, brought him into the hallway at a dead sprint, just as Seren realized what was about to happen and understood that everything had just changed. "What is going on here?" Principal Warren's voice had boomed across the hallway, and the circle of students had parted immediately. Warren was a tall black man in his 50s, who normally projected calm administrative authority, but whose face now showed genuine alarm at the scene before him. Seren mounted on Cortland, Dashiell holding back Cortland's friends, phones everywhere recording, Cortland still beneath her looking up at the principal with an expression of relief so profound it was almost theatrical. Seren had immediately raised her hands, palms out, universal signal of non-aggression, and had started to dismount, but Warren had called out, "Stay exactly where you are. Nobody move." He'd pulled out his radio, had called for security, and within seconds 2 school security officers had arrived, taking in the scene. Warren had pointed at Seren. "You, stand up slowly and step away from him." Seren had complied, had stood and stepped back, her hands still visible, her breathing controlled, but her heart hammering. Cortland had scrambled to his feet, had dramatically checked himself for injuries, and had pointed at Seren. "She attacked me. She just came out of nowhere and attacked me." The hallway had erupted in voices, everyone talking at once, and Warren had shouted for silence. "Everyone quiet! Security, escort these students to my office. Miss Holloway, Mr. Ashford, Mr. Chen." He'd looked at Cortland's friends. "You 3 as well. The rest of you, get to wherever you're supposed to be, now. And if I see anyone's phone out recording, you'll be joining us in my office." The crowd had dispersed reluctantly, and Seren had walked between the 2 security officers toward the principal's office, her mind racing. She'd been caught. She'd been mounted on another student in the middle of a hallway, and no matter the context, no matter what had led to it, the optics were terrible. She could be expelled. She could have charges pressed against her. Everything her uncle had worried about, every reason she'd walked away before, was now manifesting exactly as feared. In Principal Warren's office, a large space with windows overlooking the athletic fields, the group had arranged themselves uncomfortably. Cortland on one side with his 3 friends, Seren and Dashiell on the other, security standing near the door, Warren behind his desk with his hands folded, his expression severe. "Someone is going to explain to me right now what just happened," he'd said. Cortland had jumped in immediately. "She attacked me, Principal Warren. I was just talking to Chen here, and she came out of nowhere and tackled me to the ground. She's been weird toward me for weeks, and I think she just snapped or something. You can ask anyone, they all saw it." His friends had nodded vigorously, offering corroboration. "He's right, Principal Warren. We saw the whole thing. She just attacked him." Warren had held up his hand, silencing them, and turned to Seren. "Miss Holloway? What's your version of events?" Seren had taken a breath, had made herself speak clearly despite her voice wanting to retreat into a whisper. Cortland was threatening Dashiell. He had him pinned against the wall and was about to punch him. I intervened. Her gravelly voice had been steady, factual, absent of emotion. Cortland had scoffed. "That's a lie. I wasn't threatening anyone. We were just talking." Warren had looked at Dashiell. "Mr. Chen?" Dashiell had nodded immediately. "Seren's telling the truth. Cortland shoved me against the wall twice, and he had his fist pulled back to punch me when she stopped him. She probably saved me from getting my face broken." Warren had looked at Cortland's friends. "And you're saying you didn't see any of that?" One of them, a lacrosse player named Brock, had shrugged. "We saw them talking. We didn't see any threats." Another friend, Tyler, had added, "Honestly, Principal Warren, Seren's been really aggressive lately. A lot of people have noticed. I think she's got anger issues or something." Seren had felt rage building but had kept it suppressed, had maintained her neutral expression. Warren had studied all of them, his eyes moving from face to face, and then he'd said something that changed everything. "There are cameras in that hallway. We'll review the footage and see exactly what happened." Cortland's face had gone pale. His friends had exchanged glances. Warren had noticed. "Is there something you'd like to revise about your statements before we look at that footage?" There had been a long silence, and then Cortland had said, voice strained, "Look, maybe I was being a little rough with Chen, but that doesn't justify her attacking me. She could have gotten a teacher. She could have told someone. She didn't need to put her hands on me." The shift in his story was obvious to everyone in the room. Warren had stood up. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to review that footage, all of it. And I'm going to talk to witnesses, real witnesses, not friends with a vested interest in lying for you, Mr. Ashford. And based on what I find, there will be consequences. Severe consequences. In the meantime, all of you are suspended pending investigation. Go home. Don't come back until I call your parents and tell you it's okay. Am I understood?" The ride home had been silent and awful. Seren's mother had picked her up after Warren had called, and the disappointment on her mother's face had been harder to bear than the principal's anger. At home, Seren had explained everything, had told her parents about the weeks of bullying, the escalation, today's incident, all of it spilling out in a rush of words and emotion. Her father had listened with his doctor's face on, analytical and calm, but when she'd mentioned her BJJ background, his expression had shifted to something like understanding mixed with concern. "Why didn't you tell us this was happening?" her mother had asked, and Serene had struggled to articulate it, to explain that she'd been trying to handle it herself, that she'd thought she could wait it out, that she hadn't wanted to worry them or seem weak or admit that the new school wasn't working out. Her father had pulled her into a hug, rare physical affection from a man who usually expressed love through actions rather than touch, and had said, "You defended yourself. You defended your friend. I'm not angry at you. I'm angry at the situation, but not at you." The weekend had been agonizing. Seren hadn't been allowed to contact Dashel, part of the investigation protocol. She'd spent the time alternating between anxiety and anger, replaying the confrontation in her mind, wondering if she should have handled it differently, if there had been any other option that wouldn't have ended with her suspended and potentially expelled. She'd gone to the gym Saturday and rolled for hours, working through her emotions physically, and her coach had pulled her aside afterward and said, "Whatever happened, I hope you kept your control. That's all that matters. Did you keep your control?" Seren had nodded. "I stopped when I could have kept going." "I didn't hurt him." Her coach had smiled. "Then you did the right thing." Monday morning, Warren called Seren and her parents back to school. They'd sat in his office, same configuration as Friday but without Cortland's group, and Warren had pulled up security footage on his computer, turned the screen so they could all see. "I've reviewed all relevant footage from the past 3 months, he'd said, and I've interviewed approximately 20 students, both those who witnessed Friday's incident and those who had information about the ongoing pattern of behavior that led to it." He'd played the footage from Friday, and it showed exactly what Seren had described. Cortland shoving Dashel, Dashel trying to leave, Cortland pinning him, pulling back his fist, Seren intervening, the takedown, maintaining mount, Cortland's panicked screaming, Warren arriving. Then Warren had played other clips, Cortland and friends harassing Seren in hallways, the cafeteria food incident, the computer lab confrontation, weeks of documented bullying that the school's security system had captured and apparently no one had noticed or acted upon. "Miss Holloway," Warren had said, his voice heavy, "I owe you an apology. Multiple people failed you, myself included. This pattern of harassment should have been identified and addressed months ago, and instead it was allowed to continue until you felt you had no choice but to physically intervene. That's unacceptable, and I take full responsibility." He'd paused. "That said, I need you to understand that you cannot take matters into your own hands this way. No matter the provocation, you should have come to administration, should have reported it, should have trusted us to handle it," Seren's father had interjected. "With respect, Principal Warren, she had no reason to trust that you would handle it. Your own footage shows weeks of harassment happening in your hallways, captured on your cameras, and no one intervened. What was she supposed to think would happen if she reported it?" Warren had had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You're right. And that's why there are going to be significant changes in how we monitor student interactions and respond to bullying reports. But those changes don't alter the fact that Miss Holloway used physical force against another student. In defense of another student who was about to be assaulted," Seren's mother had added firmly. "The footage clearly shows that Cortland was the aggressor." Seren intervened to prevent violence, not to initiate it. Warren had nodded slowly. "I agree. Which is why, after consultation with the school board and our legal counsel, we've decided that Miss Holloway will return to school without further disciplinary action. The suspension is expunged from her record. She'll be able to make up any missed work." He'd turned his computer screen again, and Seren had seen what looked like a long document. Mr. Ashford and his associates, however, face a different situation. Cortland Ashford is being transferred to another school, effective immediately. His friends who participated in the harassment pattern face 2-week suspension and mandatory counseling. The school is also implementing a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, with immediate consequences for violations, and I'll be sending a letter to all parents explaining what happened and what we're doing to prevent it from happening again. The relief Seren had felt had been so intense it made her dizzy. Not expelled, not punished, vindicated, validated, believed. Her parents had thanked Warren, had asked questions about how Seren would be reintegrated, what support would be available, and Warren had assured them that he'd be monitoring the situation personally, that any hint of retaliation would be met with immediate expulsion for those responsible. Walking back into Lincoln Prep on Tuesday had felt surreal. Students stared at Seren differently now, their expressions ranging from respect to awe to uncertainty. The story had spread, mutated in the telling the way stories do, but the core elements were consistent. Seren had taken down Cortland Ashford, had mounted him, could have seriously hurt him but chose not to, and had been cleared of wrongdoing by the school. She'd become, overnight, a kind of legend. Dashiell had found her at her locker, had pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to be significant, and when he'd stepped back, his eyes were bright. "You're okay. Thank God. I've been losing my mind not being able to talk to you." They'd sat together at lunch, back in the library at their usual table, and the normalcy of it had been profoundly comforting. "People are calling you the girl who beat up Cortland Ashford," Dashiell had said. "The rumors are insane. Someone told me you're a cage fighter. Someone else said you're training to be a Navy SEAL. Seren had laughed, actually laughed, something she hadn't done freely in weeks. "I just trained BJJ. That's it. Nothing crazy." Dashiell had shaken his head, smiling. "To everyone here, that is crazy. Most people at this school have never been in a real fight. You took down the biggest bully in school like it was nothing. You're basically a superhero." Serene had rolled her eyes, but felt warmth spreading through her chest. "I'm not a superhero. I'm just someone who was tired of being pushed around." The rest of that week had been a process of adjustment. Students approached Seren cautiously, some to apologize for not stepping in before, others to express admiration or ask questions about martial arts. A girl named Melissa, who'd been in several of Seren's classes, had sat down with her in the library on Wednesday and said, "I watched Cortland mock your voice for weeks. I watched him dump your food. I watched all of it, and I never said anything. I'm really sorry. I should have stood up for you, and I didn't, and I feel terrible about it." Serene had been taken aback by the raw honesty. "It's okay," she'd started to say, but Melissa had shaken her head. "It's not okay. I learned something from watching you. I learned that staying quiet is just as bad as joining in, and I promise I'm never going to stay quiet again when I see something wrong." Serene had felt tears prick her eyes, had nodded, unable to articulate how much those words meant. Teachers treated her differently too, with a kind of careful respect that acknowledged both what had happened and what they'd failed to prevent. Mr. Valenti, her literature teacher, had asked her to stay after class one day and said, "I heard you read in my class that first week. I heard some students laugh. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that kids would be kids, that you'd be fine. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I should have shut that down immediately." Serene had accepted the apology, had felt some of the weight she'd been carrying begin to lighten. By the second week after the incident, something remarkable had happened. The social geography of Lincoln Prep had shifted. Students who'd previously claimed certain hallways, certain tables, certain spaces as their territory found those boundaries dissolving. Kids who'd been on the periphery moved toward the center. Groups that had never interacted began mixing. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't a complete revolution, but it was noticeable, a loosening of rigid hierarchies that had seemed immutable just weeks before. Serene understood that she'd become a symbol of something, a living example that bullies weren't invincible, that fighting back, in whatever form that took, was possible. She also understood the responsibility that came with that symbolism. When a younger student approached her in the hallway, nervous and quiet, and asked if she had any advice for dealing with people who picked on her, Serene had stopped, had given the question serious thought, and had said, "Tell someone in authority. Don't wait like I did. If they don't help, tell someone else. Keep telling until someone listens, and know that it's not your fault, it's never your fault, and you deserve to feel safe." The student had nodded, had thanked her, and Serene had watched her walk away, thinking about how much easier that advice was to give than to follow. But she also thought about how the ending of her own story might have been different if more people had been willing to tell, if the culture of silence and complicity hadn't been so entrenched. She couldn't change what had happened, but maybe she could help prevent it from happening to someone else. The third week brought an unexpected development. Cortland contacted her through Instagram, a message that sat in her requests folder for 2 days before she worked up the courage to open it. The message was long, clearly written and rewritten multiple times based on the formal tone, and it said in summary, "I know I don't deserve your attention or forgiveness. I know what I did was wrong, and not just wrong, but cruel, in a way that I didn't fully understand while I was doing it. My parents made me go to therapy after everything, and I've been talking about why I acted that way, and none of the reasons are excuses, but maybe they're explanations. I was dealing with pressure at home, pressure to be perfect and maintain our family's reputation, and I took out my anxiety on you because you were different, and I thought making you feel small would make me feel bigger. It didn't. It just made me a worse person. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to know that I'm sorry, really sorry, and I'm trying to be better." Serene had read the message 3 times, had felt complicated emotions swirl through her. Residual anger, cautious hope, skepticism about whether the apology was genuine or coached by his therapist or parents. She'd sat with it for another day before typing a response. "I accept your apology. I believe you can change if you choose to, but I also want you to know that what you did damaged me in ways that an apology can't immediately fix. I have to live with what you put me through. and you have to live with having put someone through that. Use that knowledge to be better. Prove through your actions that this apology means something. Don't contact me again. If I hear you're treating someone else the way you treated me, this conversation won't have meant anything. She'd sent it and blocked him immediately after, not willing to engage further, but feeling like the exchange needed to happen. She'd shown the messages to Dashiell, and he'd read them with a complicated expression. "Do you think he meant it?" Dashiell had asked, and Seren had shrugged. "I don't know, maybe. People can change. But whether he does or doesn't, that's on him. I'm done carrying his guilt for him." The fourth week, Seren was walking through the main hallway after school, heading to the parking lot where her bike waited, when she saw something that made her stop. A student, maybe a freshman based on his size, was backed against a locker by two older kids who were clearly hassling him about something. Seren had watched for just a moment, had seen the familiar body language of intimidation and fear, and had walked over without conscious decision. "Is there a problem here?" she'd asked, her gravelly voice carrying clearly, and all three students had turned to look at her. The two older kids, both of whom she vaguely recognized from around school, had immediate recognition in their expressions. This was the girl who'd taken down Cortland Ashford. They'd stepped back from the younger student, hands up in a gesture of innocence. "No problem, we were just talking," one of them had said. Serene had looked at the younger student. "You okay?" He'd nodded quickly, clearly relieved. She'd looked back at the two older kids, held their gaze steadily. "Good. Make sure it stays just talking." They'd nodded, had walked away quickly, and the younger student had looked at Seren with something like worship. "Thank you," he'd said. "They've been bothering me for weeks." I didn't know what to do. Seren had pulled out her phone, had pulled up Principal Warren's direct office extension. "Call this number. Tell him what's been happening. Tell him I referred you. He'll listen." The student had taken down the number, had thanked her again, and Serene had walked away feeling something settle into place. She couldn't be everywhere. She couldn't protect everyone. But she could use whatever influence she'd accidentally gained to make Lincoln Prep a slightly less hostile place. She could be proof that standing up to bullies was possible, and she could encourage others to do the same in whatever way they were capable of. That evening, Dashiell came over to her house, officially designated as a study session, but really an excuse to hang out without the pressures of school around them. They'd sat in her room with textbooks spread around them, but had spent more time talking than actually studying. "I've been thinking about something," Dashiell had said, lying on his back on her floor staring at the ceiling. "About how you hid who you really were because you thought it would cause problems. And then it turned out that revealing who you were actually solved problems. Not just for you, but for other people too. Like, your strength wasn't the problem. The problem was other people's inability to handle your strength." Serene had looked at him, at his profile against her light blue carpet, and had felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "That's very philosophical for someone who claimed he was bad at AP English," she'd said, keeping her tone light to cover the emotion underneath. Dashiell had turned his head to look at her, had smiled. "I contain multitudes. I'm mysterious and deep. You don't even know." They'd both laughed, and then the laughter had faded into a different kind of silence, the kind charged with unspoken things. "I'm glad you're my friend," Seren had said quietly, her gravelly voice soft in the evening light filtering through her window. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Dashiell had sat up, had moved to sit beside her where she was leaning against her bed. "I'm glad we're friends too." But Seren, he'd hesitated, and she'd felt her pulse quicken. "I don't want to mess this up or make things weird, but I need to tell you something. I don't just like you as a friend. I like you as more than that. I have for weeks, and I kept not saying anything because I didn't want to add to your stress, but now things are better and I needed you to know." Serene had felt her face heat, had felt a smile spreading despite her attempt to maintain composure. "Oh," she'd said, articulate as ever, and then, "I like you too." As more than a friend, I kept not saying anything because I thought you were just being nice to the weird girl everyone made fun of. Dashiell had shaken his head emphatically. "You're not weird. Or if you are, it's in the best possible way. And your voice, for the record, is one of my favorite things about you. It's distinctive and interesting, and you, and anyone who can't appreciate that, is an idiot." They'd kissed then, tentative and brief and sweet, and when they'd pulled apart, both of them had been smiling like idiots. "This doesn't change anything," Serene had said. "Like we're still going to be us, just more?" Dashiell had nodded. "Exactly. Still us. Just more." And that had felt right, felt like the natural progression of something that had been building since that first day in the library. The rest of the term passed in a kind of peaceful blur. Serene settled into Lincoln Prep as the person she actually was, rather than the invisible ghost she'd been trying to be. She joined the school's martial arts club, helped start a peer mediation program that trained students to intervene in conflicts before they escalated, and maintained her relationship with Dashiell, navigating the newness of being an actual couple with the same careful thought she brought to everything else. The fake Instagram account that had mocked her voice got taken down after she reported it again with support from Principal Warren's office. The students who'd followed it moved on to other entertainment. The video of the cafeteria incident gradually sank into the digital archives, replaced by newer, more current dramas. Serene's voice remained her voice, gravelly and distinctive, but it stopped being a source of shame and became just another fact about her, no more remarkable than her height or her hair color. One afternoon in late spring, Serene was sitting in the auditorium's upper balcony, her old hiding spot, but this time she was there by choice rather than necessity, enjoying the quiet during her free period. She'd been reading when she heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see one of Cortland's old friends, Tyler, approaching hesitantly. "Can I talk to you?" he'd asked, and Serene had marked her page, nodded. Tyler had sat 2 seats away, respecting her space, and had stared at his hands for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to apologize. I was there for a lot of what Cortland did to you." I laughed. "I participated. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway because Cortland was my friend, and I thought that mattered more than doing the right thing. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me or anything. I just wanted you to know that I know what I did, and I'm trying to be better." Serene had studied him, had tried to discern sincerity from performance, and had decided it didn't really matter. Even if the apology was partially self-serving, even if he was motivated by guilt or social pressure rather than genuine remorse, the fact that he'd bothered to apologize at all meant something. "Okay," she'd said, "I appreciate you saying that. And I do forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger takes energy, and I'd rather use that energy for other things. But like I told Cortland, prove it through your actions. Be better, especially when it's hard, when your friends want you to join in on something cruel. That's when it actually matters." Tyler had nodded, had stood to leave, and had paused at the top of the stairs. "For what it's worth, you walking into that hallway when Cortland was about to hit Chen. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. I keep thinking about it, about how you didn't back down even though you were smaller and everyone was watching and you could have gotten in serious trouble. I want to be that brave someday." He'd left before Serene could formulate a response, and she'd sat with his words, had felt them settle into her understanding of what had happened and what it had meant. The final week of term, Lincoln Prep held an assembly on bullying prevention and bystander intervention. Principal Warren had asked Serene if she wanted to speak, to share her experience, and she'd initially declined, uncomfortable with the idea of putting herself on display. But Dashiell had encouraged her, had pointed out that her story might help other students who were currently experiencing what she'd been through, and eventually she'd agreed. Standing on the auditorium stage, looking out at the entire student body assembled in the seats, Seren had felt her heart hammering and her palms sweating. Her gravelly voice, amplified by the microphone, had filled the space, and she'd seen some students lean forward to listen better. "I'm not going to tell you what happened to me in detail," she'd started. "Most of you already know. What I want to talk about instead is what I learned, and what I hope you'll take from it. I spent months being afraid of drawing attention, afraid of making things worse, afraid of who I might become if I stopped being afraid. And the thing I learned is that fear is what bullies rely on. They rely on their targets being too scared to fight back, and they rely on bystanders being too scared to intervene. And as long as we give them that fear, they win." She'd paused, had looked across the audience, had seen students nodding. "But here's the other thing I learned. Fighting back doesn't have to mean violence. Fighting back can mean telling a trusted adult. Fighting back can mean supporting a friend who's being targeted. Fighting back can mean refusing to laugh at someone else's humiliation. Fighting back can mean standing in a hallway and telling someone to stop. There are 100 ways to resist cruelty, and only one of them involves actual fighting." She'd smiled slightly. "I happened to use that one because I had the training, and it was the situation I was in. But most of you won't need to do that and shouldn't. What you should do is refuse to be silent. Refuse to accept that bullying is normal or inevitable or just how things are. I want to thank the people who supported me when I needed it, especially you, Dashiell." She'd looked at where he sat in the third row, had seen him smile and wave. "And I want to challenge everyone here to think about what kind of school you want Lincoln Prep to be. Do you want it to be a place where cruelty goes unchallenged? Or do you want it to be a place where everyone feels safe and valued? Because you get to choose that every day through your actions or your inactions, your choosing." The assembly had ended with applause, and students had approached Seren afterward, sharing their own stories, asking for advice, thanking her for speaking. It had been overwhelming, but also validating, proof that her experience hadn't been isolated, that the changes at Lincoln Prep were real and necessary and ongoing. The last day of the term, Seren and Dashiell walked out of Lincoln Prep together, heading toward the parking lot where both their bikes waited. The afternoon sun was warm, the air filled with the excited chatter of students beginning summer break, and everything felt lighter than it had in months. "Weird to think about how different this is from the beginning of the year," Dashiell had said, and Seren had nodded. "I keep thinking about the person I was when I first got here," Seren had said. "How small I tried to make myself, how much energy I spent trying to be invisible. And then I think about now, and how that version of me feels like a different person entirely." Dashiell had squeezed her hand. "You were always this person. You just didn't let other people see it. But now they do, and it's better. For you, for them, for everyone." They'd reached the bike rack, had unlocked their bikes, and as Seren had swung her leg over the frame, she'd glanced back at Lincoln Prep's main building, at its brick facade and the windows reflecting afternoon sun, and she'd felt something fundamental settle into place. This was her school now, not in the sense of ownership, but in the sense of belonging. She'd claimed her space here, not through violence or intimidation, but through the simple act of refusing to disappear. "You know what's funny?" Seren had said as they started riding side by side through the parking lot toward the street. Cortland and his friends spent so much energy trying to make me feel ashamed of my voice, and in the end, it was my voice that brought the principal running. It was my voice that saved me, in a weird way. All that time they spent mocking it, and it turned out to be the thing that exposed them. Dashiell had laughed, a bright sound in the spring air. That's incredibly poetic. Like, if this were a movie, that would be the perfect narrative irony. Serene had smiled, had felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Her voice, the thing that had made her a target, had ultimately been the catalyst for her vindication. The universe had a sense of humor, apparently. As they rode through Riverside's tree-lined streets, heading toward their neighborhood, Seren had thought about mercy, about that moment on the hallway floor when she'd had Cortland mounted, helpless, at her mercy, and she'd chosen not to finish what she'd started. She'd chosen restraint over revenge, control over rage, and in doing so had proven something essential. That true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about knowing when to stop. She thought about her uncle's words, about choosing peace from a position of strength rather than accepting victimization from a position of weakness. She thought about the promise she'd made and how she'd ultimately honored it, had used her skills only in defense of someone else, had walked away every time, until walking away meant abandoning someone who needed help. She thought about how the story could have ended differently, how easily she could have seriously hurt Cortland if she'd let her anger control her actions, and she felt grateful for the years of training that had taught her discipline alongside technique. Most of all, she thought about transformation, about how pain and pressure can forge you into something stronger if you let them, if you don't allow yourself to be broken by them. She'd arrived at Lincoln Prep as one person and was leaving as another. Not because she'd changed fundamentally, but because she'd stopped hiding who she fundamentally was. The person she'd become wasn't new. It was authentic, the real Seren finally allowed to exist in full view. Summer stretched ahead with its promise of peace and possibility. She'd be back at Lincoln Prep in the fall, but as someone established now, someone respected not because she'd beaten anyone up, but because she'd shown courage when it mattered, and mercy when she could have chosen vengeance. She'd be back as herself, voice and all, unapologetic and unafraid. And that, Seren thought as she rode beside Dashiell toward home, was worth every difficult moment that had led to it. The bullying had been real, the pain had been real, the fear had been real. But so was the triumph, so was the growth, so was the knowledge that she'd faced the worst high school had to offer and had come through it not by becoming cruel herself, but by remaining fundamentally good while refusing to remain fundamentally powerless. The sound of her voice, gravelly and unique, had once been a source of shame. Now it was just part of her, as unremarkable and essential as any other feature. And more than that, it was proof that the things that make us different, the things that bullies seize upon as vulnerabilities, can ultimately become our strengths if we refuse to accept the narrative that difference equals weakness. Seren Holloway had learned to stop whispering, had learned to speak at full volume, to take up space, to exist without apology. And in doing so, she'd shown an entire school that silence in the face of cruelty was a choice, not an inevitability, and that every person had the power to choose differently, to choose courage, to choose compassion, to choose to be better than the worst examples around them. The sun was setting by the time they reached Seren's house, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made everything feel cinematic, significant. Dashiell had stopped at the end of her driveway, had leaned over to kiss her goodbye, and had said, "Same time tomorrow? We could go to that hiking trail you mentioned?" Seren had nodded, had smiled, had felt contentment settle over her like a familiar blanket. "Same time tomorrow," she'd agreed, and watched him ride away before turning toward her house, where her parents waited with dinner and casual questions about her day. Normal things, good things, the kind of mundane, everyday existence she'd once taken for granted and now treasured because she'd learned how precious it was to feel safe in your own life. That night, alone in her room with the windows open to let in the evening breeze, Seren had thought about writing something down, some kind of record of what had happened and what it had meant. But words felt inadequate to capture the complexity of the experience, the way trauma and triumph had wound together into something impossible to separate. So instead, she'd pulled out her journal and written a single sentence, a reminder to herself for moments when doubt crept in or old fears resurfaced. I am not defined by how others choose to see me, but by how I choose to stand. She'd closed the journal, had turned off her light, and had fallen asleep easily for the first time in months, dreamless and peaceful, the weight she'd carried for so long finally lifted. And in the morning, she'd wake up as herself, fully and completely, ready for whatever came next with the knowledge that she'd already survived the worst and come out stronger. The story of Seren Holloway and Lincoln Prep would become part of school lore, passed down through grades, evolving in the telling but maintaining its essential truth, that one person's courage can change an entire culture, that mercy is more powerful than vengeance, and that the things we're mocked for can become the things we're celebrated for if we refuse to accept shame that isn't ours to carry. And while Seren herself would eventually move beyond high school, would go on to college and career and all the other milestones of an ordinary, extraordinary life, she would always carry with her the lessons learned in those difficult months. Stand up when you can, speak out when you must, and never, ever let anyone convince you that your difference is a weakness when it could be your greatest strength.